And it is time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. We are in the company of Anne-Elisabeth Moutet of the Sunday Telegraph. How are you?
Very well.
Pleased as well to welcome Pierre Aski of leading French news website Rue 89, 89th Street.
Hello, good evening.
Welcome back to the show.
You.
Welcome back as well to Michael Kirtley of the World Memory Film Project. Tell us what the World Memory Film
Always nice to see you. It's a World Memory Film Project is a worldwide effort to get people to make little films against genocide and against atrocities and to create a documentary out of their efforts.
All right, we're also joined by Amar Abed-Rabo, senior editor these days at Trans-Terra Media. So you hang your hat part of the time in Beirut.
Yeah, not anymore Paris-based correspondent, but Beirut-based now.
Okay.
It's a new adventure.
It's a new adventure. Well, good luck to you.
Thank you.
The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24Debate. It's now been 4 years since a protest in the Syrian city of Deraa against the brutal arrest of teenagers who'd been writing graffiti on a wall, morphed into an uprising and then into a civil war. One of the points that have been brought up by aid agencies in the build-up to this 4th anniversary, how the lights are going out on Syria, literally. 83% of the country without power. And Amar Abed-Rabo, I know you've reported in places like Aleppo. It's a shocking figure in a way. And so, I know in some places it's 95% of the areas that are in the dark.
In some places it's 100%. I mean, you have no lights at all at night. A bit of some generators or things like that. But of course, what is shocking here is the figure and because it's also mixed with the darkness of ISIS, I mean of Daesh, etc. So this is what's real. I mean, it's not just the light. The light can go off and then it will come back. But the darkness of what we see, of the cruel executions, the shelling that's still on places like Aleppo. I mean, the shelling is every day. This is really cruel, and this is even darker than the lack of light.
And now it raises horrible conundrums because aid agencies saying they don't have access to a lot of people, and they'd like to have access to those people, even if it means talking to the likes of ISIS. Your thoughts on that?
It's always the problem is how to get to the people, because in some areas you have to go through ISIS, like the doctors, the hospitals, etc. And in some other areas you have to go through Assad, which is also a very terrible choice to do. But I think at the end what is most important is to get the aid to the Syrians. That is really the priority. We still, I mean, in this year, between the 3rd anniversary and the 4th anniversary, we had agencies like the World Food Programme or the UN saying that they have no more money for Syrians. And we still know it is probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the last 50 years, with some 13 million refugees inside and outside.
And yet, Pierre Aski, sorry to put this in an almost callous way, but is there Syria fatigue? Amar mentioning the trouble raising money. Is there Syria fatigue among your readers?
Well, it's a tough question. The answer is yes. You cannot have a war going on for years without any perspective and without any possible identification with either side, because that's also the problem with the way the Syrian war has developed, is that those moderate opposition members who we thought would topple the Assad regime within months have now almost been wiped out, and the face-to-face is between two monsters, whether it's ISIS or the Syrian regime, and that's really what makes people turn their face also to the fate of the refugees. You know, it's a kind of mind-blowing event that every time we say never again, you know, never again after the Second World War, never again after Sarajevo, never again after Rwanda, and yet it comes back, you know, with a vengeance, with even more refugees, more people dead, more destructions. I mean, the picture, I saw that picture of Syria without light. It's as Amar said, you know, it's not It's a symbolic image, but it's powerful.
Michael Curley?
Well, I think that we're looking really, frankly, at the display of weakness of the United Nations in this. I mean, as you were saying, Pierre, it's the worst humanitarian disaster, at least since Rwandan genocide, and in both cases, the United Nations was ineffectual in doing anything about it. And I think that we have to analyze what it means when we say the right to stop these kinds of, not only the right, but the responsibility to protect, as the United Nations has said.
Right, but the UN tried to go in there. Lakhdar Brahimi did his best, but he came up against a brick wall, most notably at the Security Council with Russia willing to veto.
That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, in other words, what good is an international agency that says that they're going to stop humanitarian disaster of this scale? I mean, think about the scale of this. We're talking about several million people displaced, several 100,000 people killed. I mean, this kind of scale is not the type of thing that we should be looking at. And I remember I was on this show 3 years ago when you brought in, and we're speaking to Pierre's point about Syria fatigue, you brought in a reporter that has come back from spending some very enthusiastic time among the Syrian rebels who were going to topple Assad probably within a few weeks, was their hope. And there seemed to be at that point a kind of an effervescence of following of the people against Assad. Now nobody knows who to back anymore. But on the other hand, the problem is that we, as leaders of the world, I'm talking about the leaders of Europe and America and the United Nations, are not really doing that much.
And
we talk a lot, but we do very little.
Yes.
I agree with you.
My question is, when were the UN ever effectual in that kind of situation? You could argue a little bit for Bosnia, but by and large, the UN does not have it's not structured in a way that can actually be helpful, and we ought to face it rather than sort of, it's the definition of madness, is to do again and again the same thing and expect different results. I know that the diplomats in France are pretty angry that they got stopped by the American administration from bombing Syria 2 years ago, and nothing has happened since. And they feel that there was a time frame, there was a window at one stage where perhaps it could have been some use, but now it's really the feeling that there's nothing you can do. As you said, there's nobody you can back.
Of course, there is bombing going on, only the bombing is going against ISIS, both in Syria and Iraq. Iraq, where we are seeing what some are calling perhaps a turning point. That is to say, after a 10-day push, government forces backed by mostly Shiite militias entering Tikrit, but proceeding with caution in Saddam Hussein's hometown with booby traps and snipers. On Thursday, the Prime Minister of Iraq warning his advancing forces to spare civilians. The taking of Tikrit seen as a litmus test for winning over Sunnis in the eventual bigger battle to retake Iraq's second city, Mosul. We can show you a tweet sent from the outskirts of Tikrit by the AFP Deputy Bureau Chief. There you see a sign, and on the sign, a picture of Hadi al-Amri and the name of his Badr militia. Amar Abed Rabo, Tikrit is key in that respect. Is how are you going to overcome the sectarian divide?
I have to say that the behavior of the armies that are fighting ISIS is sometimes unfortunately, sometimes very similar to ISIS itself. I mean, last week, I don't know if you've seen that terrible video of a young kid who was arrested by Iraqi soldiers and being suspected of being an ISIS supporter. He's maybe 11, and they kill him on the spot, and they film it, and they're happy to do that. And it's been the same also with villages, Sunni villages that were more or less at one point dominated by ISIS. And when the Iraqi army gets in, there are massacres. So, I mean, if we have to win the battle against Daesh...
Are you encouraged, though, that here's the Prime Minister warning his own side and actually addressing this?
It has to be also a war of values. I mean, we can't do the war with the same weapons than ISIS and Daesh. Then we lost it.
The problem is that the army is not enough, so they're using Shiite militias whose behavior as Amar said, not so much better than the other side, and the Sunni villagers are terrorized by the arrival of these Shia militias. So you have this situation where who's the bad guy? You know, when you're a Sunni villager, you're leaving an oppression and finding another one. So that's really the key, is that you can bomb ISIS as much as you can, but if you don't have a political situation that makes people feel that they've been liberated, then you haven't solved the problem.
And a lot of attention given to that senior Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani, who is seen on the outskirts of Tikrit, advising the forces that are attacking. When ISIS was the order of the day at a congressional briefing on Wednesday, most of the talk was instead about Iran and its role in Iraq. The head of the U.S. military taking what you might call a pragmatic tack.
Anything anyone does to counter ISIL is, in the main, a good outcome. In other words, the activities of the Iranians, the support for the Iraqi security forces, is a positive thing in military terms against ISIL. But we are all concerned about what happens after the drums stop beating.
So it's positive for now when you're fighting against the jihadists, but we're keeping an eye on what happens next.
There's several things. First of all, this is the man who was in charge of the war for Assad when Assad was about
Qasem Soleimani.
Exactly. This he's an Iranian officer. He's extremely competent. He basically turned the situation around for Bashar at a time when they thought that Bashar was losing the war in Syria. And I mean, we mustn't forget that, you know, entering into Tikrit is the home of the dictator. It's the home of Saddam Hussein. For many of the Shia, the Iraqi Shia, not necessarily Iranians, but for many of those Shia, this is the place where the whole, you know, the dictatorship stamped on them, from which the dictatorship stamped on them for 30, 40 years. So it's a very complicated situation.
But do you agree with General Dempsey that you have to welcome the Iranians' help when it comes to taking on the jihadists?
I think Americans right now are going to go very soft on the nuclear deal with Iran precisely for that kind of reason. And I know that lots of French diplomats are saying that they are being incredibly naive in that respect. And it's not necessarily a good thing.
I think the real question is the tactical one. Is this going to have any long-term effect on ISIS? Right now, it feels good, but I think it's very likely that in the near future you're going to see reprisals on the part of the militia and the government against the populations there. I think it's very likely that you're going to see ISIS pull back in closer to Syria and then rebuild strength again. Keeping in mind that a lot of the success of ISIS wasn't just because of a military advance. It was also because of a perception and a reality on the part of the Sunnis in Iraq that they were being persecuted.
You know, there's something weird there, because, as General Dempsey said, the U.S. is more or less on the same side as Iran in Iraq. It's on the opposite side in Syria. And they are negotiating the nuclear deal. I mean, this is
not to mention the complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Yes, so this is really mind blowing in terms of the geopolitical turnover. If you look back a couple of years, and who knows, you know, to have General Dempsey saying that in a congressional audition is quite incredible and a remarkable shift.
The Americans don't want boots on the ground. I think that's the bottom.
Yes, they'd rather have Iranian boots.
Speaking of Iran,
they will get them.
Speaking of Iran, U.S. domestic politics was supposed to be this week all about Hillary Clinton's email scandal ahead of a probable run for president. Instead, it was all about that letter signed by 47 Republican senators sent directly to Tehran, warning they'd reverse any deal signed with the Obama White House. This was the front page of Tuesday's New York Daily News, Traitors, and it shows the pictures of some of those leading senators.
Well, Senator and members of the committee, my reaction to the letter was utter disbelief. During my 29 years here in the Senate, I never heard of, nor even heard of it being proposed, anything comparable to this. If I had, I can guarantee you, no matter what the issue and no matter who was president, I would have certainly rejected it.
Leading the charge, by the way, Arkansas's freshman Senator Tom Cotton, who was asked about the anger that letter has sparked with both France and Germany.
Well, all we said was the basic facts of constitutional law under our Constitution.
But this is still the international reaction from our allies.
Well, then maybe we need to send the message to the entire world.
Michael Kirtley?
Wow. To me, this is very Shakespearean. It's a farce in a certain sense. I mean, you've got this senator that's been in office for 2 months who is able. Many of the senators who signed didn't even read the document. They were on their way to the airport, and he caught them in the halls of the Congress. He not only does that, the way that he gets around everything, he first gets the signature of Mitch McConnell, to the Senate Majority Leader, and then sends it to where? To the mullahs. But it wasn't even a smart letter even in that regard, because anybody that's been to the Muslim world knows that they know a lot about the Constitution of the United States. And here we are, because they have to study that. They have to understand this to find out what they're dealing with. And so here we are trying to teach theoretically a lesson.
And do you agree with that Daily News headline, that they're traitors?
Traitors is a big word, but I think that they're really comics.
You know, I like to quote the French foreign minister. And according to Claude Angely in Le Canard Enchaîné, who's possibly the best informed French journalist on defense issues, Laurent Fabius told a group of senators and French MPs who came to see him about 2 weeks ago, he was briefing them on Iran, and he said, I really rely on the American Congress to prevent America from making a mistake, and he thinks that the deal that John Kerry is now negotiating on behalf of the Obama administration with Iran is extremely dangerous and weak. And so in so many ways, these 50 senators have behaved exactly the way Laurent Fabius thinks they did.
But I'm not sure Laurent Fabius is the best barometer for a reasonable approach to Iran, because he's been a hawk on this issue.
Yeah, well, how is that wrong?
Well, I'm not sure.
I think the president agrees with it.
In terms of Middle East stability, he's got it right.
That's an opinion, but he represents the president. No, but he
he
represents the president of France on this one. He and François Hollande are in agreement on their position on Iran. So, you know, you may say this may not be a position I agree with, but I think the diplomacy requires that he says, look, you know, you can't interfere with the government, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't think it's a good thing.
We're going to have to take a quick break. We'll come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.